I watched my sister Vanessa parade around grandmother's antique-filled living room, already distributing family heirlooms to her friends, while the lawyer sat silently in the corner, holding a sealed envelope none of us had noticed. Little did my sister know that while she celebrated her inheritance, grandmother had quietly ensured that true legacy would flow to those who understood what really mattered. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The day of Grandmother Eleanor's will reading dawned with rain pattering against leaded glass windows that had witnessed over a century of family history. I arrived at the Grand Victorian house on Maple Hill Drive 30 minutes early, yet my sister Vanessa's sleek black Mercedes already dominated the circular driveway like a predator marking territory. I hesitated before entering, raindrops sliding down my unsuitable spring jacket. Inside that house, the family wealth would be distributed according to grandmother's final wishes, and if the past 3 decades had been any indication, I already knew who would walk away with the lion's share. It had always been Vanessa, brilliant, beautiful, charismatic Vanessa, who commanded our grandmother's attention while I remained in the shadows, quietly loving the woman who seemed to merely tolerate my presence. When I finally gathered the courage to enter, I found Vanessa holding court in the formal living room. She wore a perfectly tailored black dress that whispered of both mourning and anticipation. Her dark hair swept into an elegant chignon that highlighted cheekbones, sharp enough to cut glass. 3 of her equally polished friends clustered around her, their sympathetic murmurs barely masking their curiosity about what Vanessa might inherit. "Olivia, you finally made it," Vanessa said, not bothering to rise from grandmother's favorite wingback chair, the one none of us had been allowed to sit in while Eleanor was alive. "I was just telling the girls about the summer house in Cape Cod. Remember how grandmother always said it would make the perfect writer's retreat for me?" I nodded, my voice caught somewhere between my heart and throat. The Cape Cod house had been my favorite place in the world since childhood. While Vanessa spent those summer vacations at tennis lessons and yacht club socials, I'd explored tide pools with grandmother, collected shells at dawn, and learned to identify constellations from the Widow's Walk. I'd always dreamed of owning that house someday, though I never spoke this wish aloud. "You're still doing that nonprofit work, right?" asked Cynthia, Vanessa's college roommate, who had never bothered to remember anything about my life. "Environmental? Conservation, yes," I answered, setting my worn leather handbag on a side table. "We're actually working on protecting the very coastline where—" "Mr. Fletcher is here," announced Mrs. Peterson, grandmother's housekeeper of 20 years, effectively cutting off my explanation. The diminutive woman avoided my eyes as she spoke, already deferring to Vanessa as the house's presumptive new owner. Vanessa straightened in the wingback chair, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her dress. "Send him in, please." Mr. Fletcher entered the room with the solemn gravity of a man who had delivered both windfalls and devastation to countless families throughout his career. His silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses completed the picture of the archetypal family attorney, and the leather portfolio tucked under his arm presumably contained the document that would determine our futures. "Good afternoon, ladies," he said, nodding to each of us in turn. "I trust you're both prepared for the reading of Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood's last will and testament." Vanessa's friends took this as their cue to depart, filing out with whispered promises to call later for details. I sank into the farthest corner of the sofa, trying to make myself as small as possible, a habit formed over decades of family gatherings where my accomplishments were afterthoughts, if mentioned at all. As Mr. Fletcher arranged his papers on the antique coffee table, our mother swept into the room, fashionably late as always. At 64, Victoria Blackwood remained striking, her silver-streaked hair framing a face that had graced society pages in her youth. She kissed Vanessa's cheek before taking a seat beside her, barely acknowledging my presence with a distracted wave. "Now then," Mr. Fletcher began, adjusting his glasses. "Shall we proceed?" The preliminaries passed in a blur of legal terminology until Mr. Fletcher reached the substance of the will. I braced myself for the inevitable. To my granddaughter, Vanessa Catherine Blackwood, I leave the sum of $2 million, my primary residence at 47 Maple Hill Drive, including all furnishings therein, my collection of fine jewelry, and my shares in Blackwood Enterprises. Vanessa's intake of breath was audible, not from surprise but from satisfaction. Mother squeezed her hand in silent congratulation. To my granddaughter, Olivia Margaret Blackwood, Mr. Fletcher continued, and I steeled myself for the token. Bequest, perhaps grandmother's collection of botanical prints, or a modest sum that would barely cover my student loan debt. I leave the sum of $50,000 and my personal library of books. And there it was, exactly what I had expected, a pittance compared to Vanessa's bounty. The library, while precious to me for sentimental reasons, was hardly valuable in monetary terms. $50,000 would provide a momentary cushion, but nothing close to life-changing security. "Is that all?" Mother asked, her disappointment on my behalf transparent and stinging. Surely Eleanor left Olivia something more? Mr. Fletcher glanced up, his expression unreadable. "That concludes the bequest to Ms. Olivia Blackwood as stated in the main document." Vanessa didn't even attempt to hide her triumph. "Well, grandmother always said we make our own ways in the world. Some of us just make more successful ones than others." Her tone carried the familiar blend of pity and superiority that had colored our relationship since childhood. I nodded, trying to mask the hurt with dignity. "The library is a thoughtful gift. Grandmother knew how much I loved her books." "You can keep them in the gardener's cottage," Vanessa said magnanimously. "I'm planning to renovate the main house, and honestly, all those old volumes just collect dust." The gardener's cottage, a small stone building at the edge of the property that had stood empty for years. Her generosity felt more like banishment. As Vanessa launched into her plans for the house, which apparently included converting the library into a home spa, Mr. Fletcher cleared his throat. "There is one additional matter," he said, his voice cutting through Vanessa's descriptions. "Of marble importers." From his briefcase, he withdrew a sealed envelope, cream-colored and thick, with, "To be opened only after the reading of my last will and testament," written in grandmother's unmistakable, elegant script. "What's that?" Vanessa asked, suddenly alert. "Mrs. Blackwood left this in my care 5 years ago," Mr. Fletcher explained. She was most explicit about the timing of its revelation. "Well, open it," Mother urged, leaning forward. Mr. Fletcher carefully broke the seal and removed several pages of grandmother's personal stationery. He adjusted his glasses once more and began to read. "My dearest family, if Mr. Fletcher is reading this letter, then the formal reading of my will has concluded, and certain expectations have likely been met. Before you settle too comfortably into those expectations, there are truths that must now be shared." The attorney paused, glancing up to ensure he had our complete attention. He did. "For many years, I have observed each of you, noting how you respond to privilege and responsibility. I have watched as accomplishments were celebrated and disappointments endured. I have taken measure of character when you believed no one was looking." Vanessa shifted uncomfortably in the wingback chair. Mother's smile had frozen in place. "What many of you don't know is that 15 years ago, I made a decision that would alter the course of our family legacy. Concerned about the future of Blackwood Enterprises under conventional management, I sought alternative stewardship that would honor both profitability and principle." My heart began to race, though I couldn't have explained why. "I established a separate corporate entity called Eleanor's Trust, transferring 60% of Blackwood Enterprises' true assets into this vehicle, leaving only 40% in the original corporate structure. The existence of Eleanor's Trust has been known to only myself, Mr. Fletcher, and one other person in this room." A heavy silence fell. Vanessa's perfectly manicured hand gripped the armrest of the wingback chair. To my granddaughter Olivia, who believes she has received merely books and a modest sum. You have been the sole director of Eleanor's Trust for the past 7 years, though you knew it by another name, the Blackwood Conservation Initiative. I gasped audibly. The Blackwood Conservation Initiative was my employer, the environmental nonprofit where I had worked my way up from program coordinator to executive director. I had always assumed the founding donor, listed only as EB Trust, was an anonymous environmentalist who shared our vision. Never once had I suspected it was my own grandmother, or that I had been managing her fortune all along. Olivia has demonstrated exceptional stewardship, growing the initial endowment by 43% while achieving remarkable conservation outcomes. She has proven herself not just a capable businesswoman, but a visionary leader who understands that true wealth lies in what we preserve, not merely what we possess. Tears sprang to my eyes as grandmother's words washed over me. All those years. When I thought she viewed my career with barely concealed disappointment, she had been quietly watching, evaluating, trusting me with the heart of her fortune. Therefore, with this codicil, I formally confirm that Olivia Margaret Blackwood shall retain full control of Eleanor's Trust and its holdings, which include the majority ownership of Blackwood Enterprises, the summer property at Cape Cod, and liquid assets totaling approximately $37 million. The room spun around me. Vanessa made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a protest. To my granddaughter Vanessa, your inheritance remains as stated in the will. You have always excelled at creating the appearance of success, and perhaps the resources I've left you will help you discover the substance of it as well. Vanessa's face flushed crimson. This can't be legal, she sputtered, looking to Mr. Fletcher. She can't just hide assets and then spring this on us after the will is read. I assure you, Ms. Blackwood, everything was done with meticulous, legal care, Mr. Fletcher replied, his tone conveying that he had anticipated this reaction. Your grandmother created Eleanor's Trust as a separate legal entity and transferred assets that were unquestionably hers to transfer. The codicil merely confirms what has been in place for years. But nobody told us, Mother interjected. How could Eleanor have kept something this significant from her own family? Mr. Fletcher adjusted his glasses again. There is more, he said, returning to grandmother's letter. I kept these arrangements private because I wanted to observe how you would interact with Olivia, believing her to be the lesser beneficiary. Character reveals itself most honestly when people think the power dynamics are settled. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. I looked at Vanessa, truly looked at her. Perhaps for the first time since we were children. Behind the perfect appearance and practiced confidence, I saw something unexpected: fear. Not just anger at being deceived or jealousy at my windfall, but genuine fear. Without the security of being grandmother's golden child, who was she? In closing, Mr. Fletcher continued, I hope this revelation brings necessary balance to our family. Wealth without wisdom benefits no one. Power without principle destroys its possessor. May you all find the humility to receive this truth as an opportunity for growth rather than a cause for division. He folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. There are additional documents detailing the exact holdings and structure of Eleanor's Trust, which I'll review with Ms. Olivia Blackwood at her convenience. Vanessa stood abruptly, nearly knocking over a delicate side table. This is absurd. Olivia doesn't know the first thing about running a company. She works at a... She stopped, the realization hitting her that the nonprofit she had dismissed for years was actually the vehicle for grandmother's true legacy. I think, I said, finding my voice at last, that I know more than you might expect. Mother looked between us, her loyalties visibly conflicted. There must be some mistake. Eleanor always said Vanessa had the business acumen in the family. Perhaps, I replied, thinking of the quarterly reports I had prepared for the mysterious EB Trust, the strategic plans I had developed, the staff I had hired and mentored, the partnerships I had built. But it seems grandmother saw something different. Mr. Fletcher cleared his throat. There is one final note addressed specifically to you, Ms. Olivia. Your grandmother asked that I give this to you privately. He handed me a small sealed envelope, this one bearing only my name in grandmother's handwriting. I slipped it into my pocket, unwilling to share whatever final message she had left me with Vanessa's jealous eyes watching. This is far from over, Vanessa declared, gathering her purse. I'll be calling my attorney this afternoon. That is certainly your prerogative, Mr. Fletcher responded evenly. However, I should mention that Mrs. Blackwood anticipated potential challenges. The trust documentation includes provisions that any family member who legally contests these arrangements forfeits their entire inheritance as stated in the original will. Vanessa froze, her calculations almost visible behind her eyes. $2 million and a mansion in hand versus an uncertain legal battle she would likely lose. Come, Mother, she said finally. We need to discuss this as a family. The emphasis on family clearly excluded me, despite the blood we shared. After they swept out, the grand foyer echoing with the decisive slam of the door, I remained seated, trying to process the seismic shift in my reality. Mr. Fletcher began gathering his papers, giving me space to absorb everything. She really believed in me, I said finally, more to myself than to him. All this time, when I thought she was disappointed that I hadn't followed Vanessa's path. Mr. Fletcher's professional reserve softened slightly. Mrs. Blackwood spoke of you, often and with great pride. She considered the trust arrangement a test, not of your business capabilities, which she had observed firsthand, but of whether wealth would change your essential character. And did I pass? I asked. He smiled fully then. She made her final adjustments to the trust 3 weeks before her passing. She increased your authority and removed several oversight provisions. I believe that constitutes a resounding vote of confidence. When Mr. Fletcher left, I sat alone in the suddenly silent house. My house, apparently, though that reality hadn't fully registered. Rain continued to drum against the windows, but now it sounded less melancholy and more like a gentle applause. I removed grandmother's final note from my pocket and carefully broke the seal. My dearest Olivia, it began in her familiar, elegant script. By now you know that I have been watching you far more closely than you realized. What you may not yet understand is why. When you were just 10 years old, I found you sitting in my library with my first edition of Thoreau's Walden. Do you remember? You looked up at me with such seriousness and said, "Grandmother, he says the cost of a thing is the amount of life you exchange for it." Even then, you understood value in a way your sister never grasped, despite all her advantages. Tears blurred my vision as the memory returned, the weight of the book in my small hands, the smell of leather and paper, the sunlight streaming through the library windows. I have given you responsibility for our family's legacy because you understand that wealth is not measured solely in dollars, but in difference made. The Blackwood name has opened doors for generations, but you are the first to question what lies beyond those doors and whether we deserve to enter. There will be difficult days ahead. Vanessa and your mother will not easily accept this new reality. You may be tempted to placate them with concessions or to prove yourself through ostentatious displays of your newfound power. Resist both impulses. Lead with the same quiet integrity that convinced me to trust you in the first place. The library I left you in my will is not merely a collection of books, but a repository of wisdom. When in doubt, return to those pages. My notes in the margins may offer guidance I can no longer provide in person. Finally, my dear girl, remember that the true value of inheritance is not found in assets, but in aspirations. Not what is handed down, but what you choose to build up. I have given you tools. The craftsmanship remains your responsibility. With all my love and confidence, grandmother. I folded the letter carefully and looked around the library where I sat, at the thousands of volumes surrounding me, at the chair where I had first discovered Thoreau, at the desk where grandmother had written countless letters and business correspondence. This room had always been my sanctuary in a family that had little space for someone like me. Now I understood why. Outside, the rain began to ease. Through a break in the clouds, a shaft of sunlight illuminated the garden beyond the windows. The garden where grandmother had taught me the names of flowers, the patience of cultivation, the rewards of tending what matters. Vanessa had missed more than a codicil. She had missed the entire point of grandmother's legacy, while my sister had been positioning herself to inherit a fortune. I had been unknowingly proving I deserved one. I reached for my phone to call the office, my office, the headquarters of what I now knew to be my company. There was work to be done, a legacy to honor, a path to forge. And for the first time in my life, I wouldn't be walking that path in anyone's shadow. The 24 hours following the reading of grandmother's will passed in a blur of phone calls, revelations, and adjustments to my new reality. I spent that first night in the gardener's cottage, rather than claiming one of the mansion's many bedrooms, partly because it felt presumptuous to displace Vanessa so immediately, but mostly because I needed space to process everything in. Private. The stone cottage, though small, offered surprising comfort. Grandmother had maintained it impeccably despite its disuse, with simple furnishings, clean linens, and even a well-stocked pantry. As I examined the space more carefully, I realized it hadn't been neglected at all. It had been prepared. The desk in the corner held a selection of conservation journals, including issues featuring articles I had written. The bookshelves contained environmental law references and sustainability texts. Grandmother had created this space with me in mind long before she passed. Morning brought the practical considerations of my inheritance. Mr. Fletcher arrived promptly at 9, carrying several expandable files containing documentation for Eleanor's trust and the Blackwood Conservation Initiative. We sat at the cottage's small kitchen table as he methodically explained the structure grandmother had created. Mrs. Blackwood established the trust 15 years ago after becoming concerned about the long-term direction of Blackwood Enterprises under conventional succession, he explained, spreading organizational charts before me. The company had drifted from its founding principles, prioritizing quarterly returns over sustainability. I examined the documents, recognizing much of the framework behind the conservation initiative I had been running, but now seeing the connections to the broader Blackwood holdings that had been deliberately obscured. So all this time, when I was reporting to the EB Trust about our conservation initiatives, you were effectively reporting to your grandmother, Mr. Fletcher confirmed, though she was careful to evaluate your work through objective metrics rather than familial affection. And the board members I've been presenting to quarterly? Financial and environmental advisors sworn to confidentiality about the true ownership structure. They knew you were Eleanor Blackwood's granddaughter, but were instructed to treat you with professional objectivity. I thought back to those board meetings, the challenging questions, the push for greater impact, the occasional rejection of proposals that weren't thoroughly developed. There had been no favoritism, no allowances, made for my relation to the mysterious founder. I had earned every approval, navigated every skeptical inquiry, and built the organization's reputation on measurable results. Your grandmother was quite strategic, Mr. Fletcher continued. She positioned the conservation initiative to appear as a modestly funded nonprofit while it quietly acquired land holdings, water rights, and sustainability patents that have since become extremely valuable. He slid another document across the table, a spreadsheet detailing the initiative's current assets. The figure at the bottom was staggering, nearly double what grandmother's letter had indicated. My modest environmental organization controlled resources that placed it among the most influential conservation entities in the country. This can't all be just from grandmother's initial investment, I said, scanning the growth metrics. No, indeed. While the seed funding came from the Blackwood fortune, you've leveraged those resources remarkably. The carbon offset programs you developed, the sustainable timber management model, the watershed protection partnerships with municipalities, all have generated significant returns while advancing conservation goals. I sat back, processing this information. So, I've been running a major business venture all along, just disguised as a nonprofit. A benefit corporation, technically, Mr. Fletcher corrected. Neither purely for profit nor nonprofit. Mrs. Blackwood was quite ahead of her time in utilizing this model. The initiative is mandated to generate both environmental and financial returns, with the latter reinvested in the former. A knock at the cottage door interrupted our discussion. Through the window? I saw Vanessa standing on the threshold, her expression unreadable. For a moment, I considered pretending we weren't there, but such avoidance would only postpone the inevitable confrontation. "One moment," I said to Mr. Fletcher, then moved to answer the door. Vanessa had exchanged yesterday's formal mourning attire for an immaculate white blouse and tailored pants that somehow conveyed both casual comfort and deliberate intimidation. Her hair fell in perfect waves around her shoulders, and her makeup concealed any evidence of a restless night. "We need to talk," she said without preamble. "Alone." I glanced back at Mr. Fletcher, who was already gathering his papers. "I'll return this afternoon to continue our review," he said. "There are several time-sensitive matters that will require your attention within the next 48 hours. After he departed, Vanessa entered the cottage, her critical gaze sweeping over the modest furnishings. "So this is where you've been hiding. I checked the house this morning and found you hadn't claimed any of the bedrooms." "I'm still adjusting to everything," I said, offering her coffee, which she predictably declined. "Mother is devastated," she began, perching on the edge of a chair as if concerned it might soil her clothing. "After everything she and I have done for this family, for the Blackwood name, to be sidelined like this is unconscionable." "What exactly have you done for the family, Vanessa?" I asked quietly. "Attended the right parties? Married the right man? Divorced him for the right settlement?" Her eyes flashed. "I've maintained our social position. I've served on the boards that matter. I've kept the Blackwood name relevant in circles where it counts." Circles that grandmother ultimately decided didn't count enough, apparently. Vanessa's perfect composure cracked slightly. "You have no idea what it takes to maintain the kind of connections I've cultivated. The constant attention to detail, the strategic relationships, the exhausting social obligations." "You're right," I acknowledged. "Just as you have no idea what it takes to develop conservation frameworks that actually make a difference, to manage staff who are passionate but underpaid, to balance ecological impacts against community needs." We stared at each other across the cottage's small living space, two sisters who had grown up in the same family yet inhabited entirely different worlds. "I spoke with Harrison this morning," Vanessa said, referring to her attorney. "He believes we have grounds to challenge the Codicil based on undue influence. Grandmother was 87 when she died. It wouldn't be difficult to suggest cognitive impairment." The threat hung in the air between us. I could fight it, of course. Mr. Fletcher had already indicated the strength of the legal arrangements grandmother had established. But the prospect of a protracted legal battle with my sister, splashing family business across court documents, made my stomach turn. "Is that really what you want?" I asked. "To drag grandmother's mental capacity through probate court? To publicly challenge her judgment after spending your entire life holding her up as the paragon of wisdom and sophistication whenever it suited you?" Vanessa's carefully manicured nails tapped against the arm of her chair. "What I want is what should have been mine. What would have been mine if you hadn't somehow manipulated her? The accusation stung, despite its absurdity. I didn't even know about the trust, Vanessa. I've been running the initiative thinking it was funded by some anonymous environmentalist. If I'd been trying to manipulate grandmother, don't you think I would have at least figured out that she was behind it? A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. Then why? Why would she build you this elaborate secret empire while letting everyone, including you, believe I was the favored heir? That was the question at the heart of everything, the one neither of us had fully articulated until now. Why had grandmother constructed such an elaborate test? What had she hoped to prove or disprove about each of us? I think, I said slowly, considering my words, she wanted to see who we truly were when we thought no one who mattered was watching. You believed you had her approval, her fortune, her legacy secured. I believed I had to make my own way without any of those advantages. We both revealed our characters under those conditions. Vanessa was silent for a long moment. And she found mine wanting, she finally said, an unfamiliar vulnerability in her voice. She found mine consistent, I corrected gently. And perhaps yours too focused on appearances rather than substance. My sister stood abruptly and moved to the cottage window, looking out at the grand house beyond. Do you have any idea what it's like to be measured against impossible standards your entire life? To know that nothing you achieve is ever quite enough? The question caught me off guard. Of course I do. I've been measured against you since we were children. She turned, genuine surprise on her face. Me? I was measured against grandmother's mythical expectations, the perfect Blackwood woman who excels socially, marries strategically, serves philanthropically, all while never showing a moment's weakness or uncertainty. While I was measured against you, I said quietly. The beautiful, brilliant daughter who embodied everything our parents valued. Every family gathering included a detailed accounting of your achievements, followed by a cursory, and Olivia is still doing her environmental work. As if saving ecosystems was a phase I was going through. Like your semester of pottery in college. Something shifted in Vanessa's expression. Not quite empathy, but perhaps the first recognition that our experiences of the same family had been profoundly different. So what happens now? She asked. You take everything and I'm supposed to smile graciously about my consolation prize. We could approach this differently, I suggested. Not as a winner and loser, but as two people with complementary skills facing a new reality. What do you mean? I took a deep breath, formulating an idea that had been germinating since my meeting with Mr. Fletcher. Blackwood Enterprises needs a significant course correction if it's going to thrive in a changing economy. The majority control that Eleanor's trust holds gives me the power to implement that change, but the process would benefit from someone who understands the social landscape and institutional relationships that I've never navigated. Vanessa's eyes narrowed. You're offering me a job? Working for my little sister? I'm suggesting a partnership, I clarified. One that acknowledges your strengths and mine. The house, the money and the will, those remain yours regardless. But there could be a meaningful role for you in the transformed Blackwood Enterprises if you're interested in building something rather than just inheriting it. She studied me with an appraising gaze I recognized from grandmother. The look that assessed not just the proposal before her, but the layers of motivation beneath it. Why would you offer this after everything? The ways I've dismissed you over the years, the condescension, the social snubs. I thought about grandmother's final letter, about resisting the temptation to prove myself through ostentatious displays of newfound power. Because this isn't about settling scores. It's about honoring grandmother's real legacy, not just her money but her vision. She built Blackwood Enterprises to last generations, to adapt and evolve rather than calcify around outdated practices. And you think I can contribute to that? I know you can, if you choose to. You have skills I don't. Social intelligence, strategic relationship building, an understanding of how influence flows through informal networks. The question is whether you want to apply those skills to something more meaningful than charity. Galas and country club politics. Vanessa didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked slowly around the cottage, examining the books on the shelves, the simple furnishings, the notes I'd already begun making about the trust's holdings. "Grandmother prepared this place for you," she observed. "Even while letting me believe the main house would be mine, she was quietly creating this space that perfectly suits you." Yes. Did she prepare anything for me? Any indication that she saw beyond my social climbing and materialism to something worthwhile? The question contained a vulnerability I had never witnessed in my confident, polished sister. For the first time, I glimpsed the insecurity beneath her perfect exterior, the constant striving for a validation that seemed perpetually withheld. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "But perhaps the opportunity she created through this situation is itself a kind of preparation, a chance for you to discover aspects of yourself that have been overshadowed by the role you thought you needed to play." Vanessa brushed an invisible piece of lint from her immaculate slacks. "I'll need time to think about this partnership idea, and I'll want to see exactly what you're proposing before I commit to anything." Of course, I'm still learning the full scope of the holdings myself. Once I have a clearer picture, we can discuss specific possibilities. She moved toward the door, then paused. "The Cape House. Does the trust control that too?" "Yes," I confirmed, remembering the property spreadsheet Mr. Fletcher had shown me, along with the majority stake in Blackwood Enterprises and several other assets. A flash of the old Vanessa resurfaced. "I've already told half of Boston about my plans for summer parties there. I've practically promised Genevieve Sterling she could host her daughter's engagement celebration on the lawn." Rather than irritation, I felt a surprising wave of amusement. Some things about Vanessa would likely never change. Her social calendar would always factor into major life decisions. "I'm not planning to block you from using the Cape House," I said, "though I might suggest some sustainability upgrades to the property if it's going to host frequent events." She regarded me with a slightly bewildered expression, as if still struggling to reconcile her perception of her easily dismissed sister with the woman who now controlled the family fortune. "You've changed," she said finally. "No," I replied. "I'm exactly who I've always been. You're just seeing me clearly for the first time." After Vanessa left, I returned to the documents Mr. Fletcher had brought, trying to absorb the enormity of what I'd inherited. Beyond the financial assets and property holdings lay a complex web of responsibilities. To the environment I'd committed my career to protecting, to the employees who depended on both the Conservation Initiative and Blackwood Enterprises for their livelihoods, and perhaps most challenging, to a family legacy that had nearly fractured under the weight of misaligned values. My phone vibrated with a text message from Marco, my deputy director at the initiative. "Heard anything about the anonymous donor? Annual funding approval usually comes through by now." I stared at the message, realizing that my staff remained unaware of the seismic shift in our organization's structure. To them, we were still a modestly funded nonprofit waiting on the goodwill of a mysterious benefactor, not the centerpiece of a multi-million-dollar trust with controlling interest. In one of the region's oldest family businesses, "Meeting with the representative today," I texted back. "We'll update the team tomorrow." As I set down my phone, the magnitude of the transition ahead became clearer. The secrecy grandmother had maintained served important purposes during her lifetime, but continuing it indefinitely would create unsustainable complications. Key staff would need to understand the true nature of our organization to effectively implement the integrated vision I was beginning to formulate. The cottage suddenly felt too confined for the scale of planning required. I gathered the most crucial documents and walked up the winding path toward the main house. My house now, though the thought still felt foreign. The morning sunlight illuminated the Victorian architecture in a way that emphasized its dignity rather than its ostentation. Grandmother had always valued quality over display, substance over spectacle. The house reflected that philosophy with its understated elegance and practical floor plan despite its impressive size. Entering through the kitchen rather than the formal front entrance, I found Mrs. Peterson preparing a light lunch. The housekeeper's expression registered surprise at my arrival through the service entrance. "Ms. Olivia, I didn't realize you were— that is, I would have prepared something for you if I'd known you were coming up from the cottage." "It's fine, Mrs. Peterson," I assured her. "I'm not expecting any special treatment. Actually, I was hoping to work in the library if it's not being used." "The library is— well, it's yours now, isn't it?" she said, a note of uncertainty in her voice. Clearly, the household staff had already been informed about the changed circumstances, but remained unsure about the practical implications. "I suppose it is," I acknowledged. "But this transition will take time for everyone. Please don't feel you need to change your routines or responsibilities immediately. We'll figure out any necessary adjustments together over the coming weeks." Relief softened her features. "Your grandmother always said you had a practical mind, not one for unnecessary disruptions." "Did she speak of me often?" I couldn't help asking, hungry for confirmation that grandmother's confidence in me hadn't been a recent development. Mrs. Peterson smiled. "More than you might think, especially after your visits or when news arrived about your conservation work. She kept a file in her desk, articles about your projects, photographs from field sites. She was particularly proud of that watershed restoration initiative that won the governor's award last year." This revelation landed like a physical touch, gentle but startling. While I had believed grandmother merely tolerated my environmental career, she had been privately collecting evidence of my achievements, taking pride in work that the rest of the family dismissed as idealistic but inconsequential. "Thank you for telling me that," I said, my voice slightly unsteady. "It means a great deal to know she was paying attention." "Oh, she paid attention to everything," Mrs. Peterson assured me. Nothing much escaped Mrs. Blackwood's notice, for better or worse. With that slightly ominous observation, the housekeeper returned to her lunch preparations while I made my way to the library. The room welcomed me with familiar scents of leather bindings, beeswax polish, and the subtle perfume grandmother had worn for as long as I could remember. I ran my fingers along the spines of books that had shaped my understanding of the world, pausing at the shelf where I had first discovered Thoreau's Walden as a child. The volume still occupied its place of honor, a first edition grandmother had acquired decades ago. I carefully removed it from the shelf and opened it to find her penciled annotations in the margins, just as her letter had promised. Next, to Thoreau's famous line about the cost of things being measured in life exchanged, she had written, "Consider the true price of power and acquisition. What parts of ourselves do we surrender in their pursuit?" I sat at her desk, the leather chair cool against my skin, and began to organize my thoughts about the path forward. Blackwood Enterprises had drifted from its founding principles according to Mr. Fletcher, prioritizing short-term financial returns over sustainable growth. The controlling interest Eleanor's trust now exercised provided an opportunity to realign. The company with more balanced priorities, profitability with purpose, growth with responsibility. Opening my laptop, I began drafting an integrated framework that would connect the Conservation Initiative's environmental expertise with Blackwood Enterprises' market position and resources. The initial outline took shape quickly, building on approaches I had already implemented at the initiative, but scaled to address larger systems and industries. Absorbed in this planning, I barely noticed the lengthening shadows until Mrs. Peterson knocked gently to inform me that Mr. Fletcher had returned and awaited me in the study across the hall. I gathered my notes and crossed the corridor to continue the process of understanding my inheritance and the responsibilities it entailed. The education that began that afternoon extended late into the evening and resumed early the next morning. By the time I called an all-staff meeting at the Conservation Initiative 3 days later, I had absorbed enough to present a clear vision for our organization's expanded role and resources. Standing before my team in our modest conference room, I finally revealed the truth about our anonymous benefactor and the greater purpose Grandmother had designed for our work. For 7 years, we've operated believing we were a small but effective conservation nonprofit, I explained to their astonished faces. In reality, we've been the environmental conscience and innovative core of a much larger enterprise. Eleanor Blackwood, my grandmother, established this organization not as a charitable afterthought, but as the foundation for transforming her family's business interests toward sustainability and responsibility. Marco, who had worked alongside me from the initiative's early days, was the first to find his voice. So all those quarterly reports we prepared for the mysterious EB Trust were being evaluated by my grandmother and her advisors. Yes, but the objectives and achievements were absolutely real. The watershed protections, the carbon sequestration projects, the sustainable forestry models, all have generated both environmental benefits and financial returns that have been reinvested in our mission. And now? Asked Layla, our brilliant but habitually skeptical research director. Now we have the opportunity and responsibility to expand our approach beyond demonstration projects and local initiatives. With controlling interest in Blackwood Enterprises, we can implement our sustainability frameworks across multiple industries and at scales we previously could only dream about. The discussion that followed was intense, probing, occasionally heated. Exactly what I would expect from the dedicated professionals who had committed themselves to environmental protection within a system that often seemed rigged against it. They raised legitimate concerns about mission drift, corporate capture, compromise of values. I welcomed every challenging question, recognizing that their skepticism would help refine our approach as we navigated this unprecedented opportunity. By meeting's end, cautious excitement had replaced the initial shock. The team began generating ideas for how our proven methodologies could scale across Blackwood's various business units, identifying potential resistance points and knowledge gaps we would need to address. As the staff filed out, energized by possibilities none of us had imagined at the week's beginning, Marco lingered behind. "You know this won't be easy," he said. "Transforming established business cultures rarely is, even with majority control." "I know," I acknowledged. "That's why I've asked Vanessa to consider a partnership role. She understands institutional dynamics and social networks in ways I never will." He raised an eyebrow. "Your sister? The one who once referred to our river restoration project as playing in the mud with taxpayer money?" "The very same," I confirmed with a small smile. "People can surprise you when given the chance. Grandmother certainly surprised me." As I gathered my notes from the conference table, Marco studied me with the directness of long friendship. "How are you really doing with all of this? It's an enormous shift, not just professionally but personally. Family dynamics, wealth, responsibility on this scale." The question gave me pause. In the whirlwind of revelation and planning, I had scarcely examined my own emotional response to Grandmother's final lesson. "I'm still processing," I admitted. "There's a part of me that wishes she had simply told me what she was doing, that she was proud of my work. Another part understands why this elaborate test was necessary, not just to evaluate my capabilities, but to protect me from being defined solely as a Blackwood heiress, rather than building my own identity and expertise." She gave you space to become yourself before giving you her legacy," Marco observed. "That's a rare kind of wisdom." "Yes," I agreed, thinking of Grandmother's final letter. The question now is whether I can apply that same wisdom going forward, honoring the trust she placed in me while creating space for others, including Vanessa, to grow beyond the roles they've assumed. Later that evening, as I returned to the gardener's cottage rather than the main house, still more comfortable in the space grandmother had designed specifically for me, I received a text message from Vanessa. Had dinner with mother. Discussed. Your partnership proposal. Tentatively interested with conditions. Breakfast tomorrow at the house to discuss? I've instructed Mrs. Peterson to prepare those ridiculous organic blueberry pancakes you always favored. I smiled at the message, simultaneously accommodating and controlling, conciliatory and commanding. Some aspects of Vanessa would never change. But perhaps, like the Blackwood legacy itself, she contained depths and possibilities that had yet to find expression. See you at 8, I texted back, looking forward to hearing your thoughts. Setting my phone aside, I settled into the cottage's comfortable armchair with grandmother's annotated copy of Walden, which I had borrowed from the library. Turning pages by the warm lamplight, I discovered another margin note that seemed particularly relevant to the path ahead. The greatest inheritance we leave is not what we accumulate, but what we envision beyond our time. Assets transfer easily. Wisdom must be discovered anew by each generation through their own experience. Grandmother had given me far more than control of material assets. She had crafted an opportunity to transform not just a family business, but the relationship between business and the natural world. The responsibility was enormous, the potential for failure real, the resistance certain. Yet as I closed the book and prepared for sleep, I felt a profound sense of readiness, not because I had all the answers, but because I had spent years developing the capacity to ask the right questions and the persistence to pursue meaningful solutions. Those qualities, far more than the financial resources now at my disposal, would determine whether I proved worthy of the trust grandmother had placed in me. Tomorrow would bring negotiations with Vanessa, strategic planning with the initiative, team, and countless decisions about the future of Blackwood Enterprises. But tonight, in the quiet space grandmother had prepared for me, I allowed myself to acknowledge the truth at the heart of her elaborate arrangement. She had seen me, truly seen me, all along. The breakfast meeting with Vanessa began with the strained politeness of diplomatic negotiations between historically hostile nations. We sat at opposite ends of the sunlit breakfast nook, while Mrs. Peterson served her famous blueberry pancakes, organic as requested, though Vanessa picked, at hers with the wariness of someone suspecting a nutritional conspiracy. I've been reviewing the portfolio details Harrison obtained, Vanessa began, referring to documents her attorney had apparently secured. The structure is fascinating, Byzantine actually. Grandmother created quite the labyrinth to conceal what she was doing. Mr. Fletcher explained that the complexity served specific purposes, I replied, cutting into my pancakes. Legal protection, tax efficiency, and of course, discretion. Yes, discretion, Vanessa echoed, setting down her fork. 15 years of elaborate secrecy from her own family. One has to admire the commitment to the deception, if nothing else. I recognized the hurt beneath her sarcasm. Despite her outward focus on the business implications, Vanessa was still processing the personal dimensions of grandmother's arrangements. The fact that Eleanor had systematically hidden such significant decisions from the granddaughter who thought they shared everything. I don't think deception was her primary motive, I offered carefully. From what Mr. Fletcher explained, she began with legitimate concerns about Blackwood Enterprises' direction and gradually developed this approach as a way to evaluate potential stewardship without the distortion of expectations. You mean my expectations, Vanessa clarified. Let's not tiptoe around it. She wanted to see if you could manage substantial resources without knowing they were coming to you, while simultaneously watching whether I would become insufferable in anticipation of an inheritance I ultimately wouldn't fully receive. Put so bluntly, it sounded manipulative, even cruel. Yet I sensed grandmother's motives had been more nuanced than Vanessa's interpretation suggested. I think she wanted to see our authentic selves, I said, not who we might become with the sigh. promise or burden of her fortune, but who we already were when operating according to our own values and priorities. Vanessa sipped her coffee, studying me over the rim of her cup. And what she saw in me was apparently disappointing enough to redistribute the majority of her assets. Or what she saw in both of us informed how she structured the inheritance to leverage our respective strengths, I countered. You received substantial personal assets, the mansion, the jewelry collection, significant liquid capital. I received operational control of business entities I was already effectively managing without realizing it. This reframing seemed to catch Vanessa off guard. You think she matched the inheritances to our capabilities, rather than simply favoring you? I think she recognized that I had demonstrated certain skills relevant to the long-term sustainability of Blackwood Enterprises, while you've excelled in areas more aligned with personal wealth management and social positioning. The subtle recalibration of grandmother's decision from rejection to recognition had a visible effect on Vanessa. Her defensive posture softened slightly, though wariness remained in her eyes. That's a generous interpretation, she conceded. It's also practical, I replied, which brings us to your conditions for considering a partnership role. Vanessa straightened, transitioning smoothly from wounded granddaughter to polished negotiator. Yes, I've outlined 3 primary requirements. She extracted a neatly typed document from her designer handbag and slid it across the table. I scanned the points while she elaborated. First, formal recognition as Chief Brand Officer for all Blackwood entities, with corresponding compensation and decision-making authority over public-facing aspects of both Blackwood Enterprises and the Conservation Initiative, including final approval on marketing materials, public statements, and strategic partnerships where reputation is a significant factor, I read aloud, noting the careful wording that carved out a substantial sphere of influence without challenging my overall control. Second, retention of the Cape Cod property as my personal summer residence, though ownership may remain with the trust. This would include an annual maintenance budget and priority in scheduling its use. This request surprised me with its moderation. Vanessa could have demanded outright ownership of the Cape House, but instead proposed an arrangement that acknowledged the trust's legal rights while securing her practical access to the property she valued. And third, a seat on the board of Eleanor's trust, with full voting rights on major acquisitions, divestitures, and leadership appointments. This last requirement was the most significant, a request for meaningful governance participation rather than merely symbolic inclusion. It reflected either genuine interest in the trust's operations or strategic positioning for future influence, perhaps both. These are reasonable starting points for discussion, I acknowledged, setting the document aside. I'd want to clarify certain aspects, particularly the boundaries between brand oversight and operational decisions, which can sometimes blur. Of course, Vanessa agreed smoothly. I've also prepared a more detailed addendum covering specific responsibilities. She produced another document, this one substantially thicker. You'll find I've been quite thorough in anticipating potential areas of overlap or conflict. I couldn't help but smile. While I had spent the past days absorbing the financial and organizational dimensions of my inheritance, Vanessa had been equally diligent in crafting a role that would leverage her skills, while carving out territory she could definitively claim as hers. I'll review this with Mr. Fletcher, I promised. But preliminary impression, this seems like a constructive framework. You've clearly given it serious thought. I always have a plan B, she replied with a hint of her usual confidence, and C through F if necessary. As we continued discussing the practicalities of her proposed role, I observed subtle shifts in Vanessa's engagement. The performative aspects of her personality, the carefully modulated voice, the strategic charm, the practiced gestures, gradually gave way to genuine animation as she outlined her vision for repositioning the Blackwood brand in contemporary markets. The Conservation Initiative's work provides perfect material for authentic impact narratives, she explained, warming to her subject. But it's been criminally underutilized from a brand perspective. You've been doing remarkable environmental restoration without capturing the reputational benefits that could amplify your influence with key stakeholders. We've been focused on the work itself rather than its presentation, I acknowledged. Exactly, which is admirable but ultimately self-limiting. Imagine coordinating the initiative's watershed protection programs with strategic messaging to municipal leaders, connecting Blackwood Enterprises' manufacturing innovations with the resulting environmental metrics. The sustainability story practically writes itself, but it needs cohesive narration across all touchpoints. For the first time, I glimpsed what grandmother might have recognized as valuable in Vanessa's approach, not merely social climbing or status preoccupation, but a sophisticated understanding of how perception shapes opportunity, how strategic positioning can transform good work into influential work. You've clearly been thinking about this beyond just securing a title, I observed. Something flickered across Vanessa's face, perhaps surprise at being recognized for substance rather than appearance. I've followed the initiative's work more closely than you might realize, not because I cared particularly about wetland, biodiversity, or carbon sequestration metrics, but because I was curious about what captured grandmother's attention when she thought no one was looking. This admission revealed a perceptiveness I had underestimated. While I had been oblivious to grandmother's involvement with the conservation initiative, Vanessa had apparently noticed her interest and investigated its source, even without understanding the full financial connection. What else did you notice about grandmother's hidden interests? I asked, genuinely curious about what Vanessa's different perspective might have detected. She considered the question. She followed your career, with unusual attention for someone she barely mentioned in family gatherings. Whenever you were featured in industry publications or received professional recognition, those materials would disappear into her private study for days before resurfacing in the library archives. I assumed she was monitoring you out of concern, that you might embarrass the family with your environmental activism, when in fact she was tracking my professional development for entirely different reasons, I murmured. She also began attending lectures on sustainable business practices about 10 years ago, university symposiums, expert panels, even some rather dry regulatory conferences. Mother and I assumed it was her way of maintaining intellectual engagement in retirement. Now I suspect she was educating herself about the business transformation she was quietly orchestrating. These glimpses of grandmother's double life, the public matriarch fulfilling expected roles while privately pursuing a radical reimagining of her legacy, added dimensions to my understanding of her motives and methods. She played an incredibly long game, I reflected, preparing me for responsibilities I didn't know were coming while allowing the family to believe in a conventional succession plan that was never her actual intention. Which raises the question, Vanessa said, folding her napkin precisely, of what game we're playing now. Are you genuinely interested in partnership, Olivia, or is this your version of keeping enemies closer? A way to manage me while you implement whatever vision grandmother prepared you for? The directness of the question demanded equal honesty in response. I'm interested in effectiveness, I said after a moment's consideration. The trust controls substantial resources that could significantly advance environmental and social progress if deployed strategically. Your understanding of institutional dynamics, relationship networks, and brand positioning represents expertise I don't possess and would take years to develop. So yes, I'm genuinely interested in partnership, not from sentimentality, but practicality. Vanessa studied me with new attentiveness. That's refreshingly transactional. I had expected appeals to family loyalty or shared heritage. Would those have been more persuasive? No, she admitted with a small laugh. Much less, actually. I've had my fill of family obligation rhetoric. Clarity about mutual benefit is far more compelling. Our conversation shifted then to specific initiatives where her brand expertise might complement the trust's environmental priorities. For the next hour, we outlined preliminary strategies for integrating the conservation initiative's scientific credibility with more sophisticated messaging frameworks, identifying opportunities to leverage Blackwood's manufacturing capabilities for scaled implementation of sustainable technologies we had developed and tested at pilot sites. As Mrs. Peterson cleared the breakfast dishes, Vanessa glanced at her watch. "I should go. I have a foundation board meeting at 11. She gathered her documents, then hesitated. "There's one other matter I've been meaning to raise. Mother." My stomach tightened. In the whirlwind of revelations and planning, I had maintained minimal contact with Victoria Blackwood, responding to her increasingly agitated messages with brief assurances that we would discuss the situation soon. "She's not taking this well," Vanessa continued. "The changed inheritance arrangement, your new position, the implications for her own financial security. It's triggering every insecurity she's ever had about her place in the Blackwood hierarchy." "Grandmother provided for her quite generously in the will," I pointed out. "Her circumstances haven't materially changed." "Her status has," Vanessa corrected. "For decades, she's defined herself as the mother of grandmother's chosen successor. Now that narrative has collapsed, and she's struggling to reconstruct her identity within the family's new power structure." This insightful analysis of our mother's psychological state surprised me. Vanessa had always seemed indifferent to emotional undercurrents, focused exclusively on practical advantages and social positioning. Yet here she displayed nuanced understanding of Victoria's complex reaction to the inheritance revelations. "What do you suggest?" I asked, recognizing Vanessa's greater expertise in managing our notoriously difficult mother. "A gesture that acknowledges her historical role while establishing clear boundaries for her future involvement. Perhaps naming the Blackwood Foundation's new cultural arts initiative after her? She's always fancied herself a patron of the arts, though her actual contributions have been more social than substantive." The suggestion demonstrated Vanessa's gift for symbolic solutions to emotional problems, creating recognition that satisfied ego needs without conceding actual authority. "I'll speak with Mr. Fletcher about establishing the Victoria Blackwood Cultural Heritage Program," I agreed. "It would align well with our broader community engagement strategy while giving Mother a dignified platform." "Perfect," Vanessa nodded, standing to leave. "I'll prepare her for your call. Frame it as honoring her lifelong commitment to cultural preservation rather than consolation for the inheritance arrangement." As she gathered her belongings, Vanessa paused at the breakfast nook window, looking out over the estate gardens. "It's strange," she said quietly. "I've spent my entire adult life positioning myself to inherit all this. The house, the company, grandmother's social capital. I believed securing the Blackwood legacy was my primary purpose. Now that I've lost that presumed birthright, I feel oddly unburdened." The admission held a vulnerability I had rarely witnessed in my perpetually composed sister. "Perhaps there's freedom in recalibration," I suggested. "In discovering that your value isn't determined by fulfilling someone else's expectations." Vanessa turned from the window, something unreadable flickering across her face. "Is that what you've found in your environmental crusades? Freedom from expectations?" "Not freedom from them," I clarified, "but freedom to choose which expectations matter, including my own." She considered this, then nodded slightly. "I'll review your response to my proposal when it's ready. In the meantime, I've already drafted initial messaging concepts for the rebranding strategy we discussed. You'll have them by end of day." With that business-like conclusion, she departed, leaving me to reflect on our conversation while preparing for my next meeting, a virtual strategic planning session with Marco and the Conservation Initiative's leadership team. The video conference revealed both excitement and anxiety among my core staff as they grappled with the implications of our expanded resources and responsibilities. Marco had artfully structured the agenda to alternate between ambitious vision setting and pragmatic implementation questions, ensuring that theoretical possibilities remained grounded in operational realities. The integration of Blackwood's manufacturing capabilities with our restoration technologies creates unprecedented scaling opportunities, Layla explained, sharing her screen to display experimental results from our wetland remediation projects. But quality control becomes exponentially more complex when moving from our controlled demonstration sites to industrial application. Which is why we need embedded sustainability specialists within each Blackwood division, added Ravi, our IE operations director. People who understand both our environmental methodologies and the practical constraints of commercial manufacturing. The discussion continued in this vein, identifying connection points between the conservation initiative's proven approaches and Blackwood Enterprises' industrial capacity, while anticipating challenges in organizational culture, technical, implementation, and market positioning. There's another dimension we should consider, I said during a natural pause in the conversation. My sister Vanessa has proposed taking a formal role focusing on brand integration and public messaging across all Blackwood entities. Surprise registered on several faces, followed by skepticism. Vanessa Blackwood? Marco clarified, as if perhaps I had another sister they hadn't heard about. The one who referred to environmental regulations as bureaucratic obstacles to actual productivity at last year's Chamber of Commerce dinner? The very same, I confirmed with a small smile, though I believe her perspective is evolving in light of recent developments. With respect, Olivia, Layla interjected, bringing someone with her history and viewpoint into our operations could undermine the integrity of our work. The Conservation Initiative has built its reputation on scientific credibility and principled advocacy. Ms. Blackwood represents precisely the profit-first mentality we've spent years challenging. Their concerns echoed my own initial reservations, yet I had glimpsed something in Vanessa during our breakfast conversation that suggested potential for genuine contribution rather than mere interference. I understand your hesitation, I acknowledged, and I share your commitment to maintaining our scientific and ethical standards. But I also recognize that transforming Blackwood Enterprises will require navigating institutional cultures and stakeholder relationships that Vanessa understands far better than we do. So this is a strategic alliance rather than a family accommodation? Ravi asked directly. Exactly. Vanessa brings specific expertise in areas where we've historically been less effective: brand positioning, strategic communications, social, network leverage. Our environmental and operational expertise combined with her institutional knowledge creates a more complete toolkit for driving systemic change. The team didn't appear fully convinced, but their objections shifted from outright rejection to practical questions about role definition, decision-making protocols, and safeguards against mission drift. By the meeting's end, we had outlined a provisional framework for integrating Vanessa's proposed brand function with our existing operations, complete with clear boundaries, collaborative processes, and accountability mechanisms. As the video conference concluded, Marco remained online for a private conversation. Bold move, bringing Vanessa into the fold, he observed once the others had disconnected. Are you sure this isn't more about family peace than organizational strategy? I've asked myself the same question, I admitted. But this morning's discussion revealed more substance to her thinking than I'd anticipated. There's genuine potential for complementary contribution if we can establish the right parameters. And if we can't? If her profit-maximizing instincts clash with our sustainability principles? Then we'll address those conflicts directly, I replied. But remember, I control Eleanor's trust, which holds majority interest in all Blackwood entities. Vanessa can influence direction but not override fundamental priorities. Marco nodded thoughtfully. It's still remarkable watching you step into this role so naturally. A week ago, you were running what we all thought was a modestly funded nonprofit. Now you're orchestrating the transformation of a major family enterprise without missing a beat. His observation gave me pause. Had the transition truly been as seamless as it appeared from the outside? The past days had been so consumed with practical necessities that I'd had little time to process the psychological dimensions of my changed circumstances. I don't know that it's been natural so much as necessary, I reflected. There's been no space to question whether I'm ready or qualified, only a series of decisions that need making and conversations that need having. That's what leadership looks like in practice, Marco pointed out, especially during transitions. You focus on what needs doing rather than how you feel about doing it. After ending the call, I found myself drawn back to grandmother's library. The afternoon sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes dancing above leather-bound volumes and creating the impression of suspended time in this sanctuary of accumulated knowledge. I selected several books from shelves, dedicated to business ethics and leadership philosophy, then settled into grandmother's reading chair with a legal pad to sketch preliminary responses to Vanessa's partnership proposal. The familiar activity of note-taking and analysis provided comforting structure amid the continuing aftershocks of inheritance revelation. Halfway through my review, Mr. Fletcher arrived for our scheduled meeting regarding the formation of the Victoria Blackwood Cultural Heritage Program. The attorney carried his customary expandable folders, this time accompanied by a slim wooden box I didn't recognize. "Good afternoon, Ms. Blackwood," he greeted me formally. "I see you've made yourself at home in the library. Your grandmother would approve." She considered this room the intellectual heart of the house. "It's where I feel most connected to her," I admitted, though I'm still adjusting to the idea that all this is now mine to steward. Mr. Fletcher nodded, setting his materials on the library table. "Regarding your mother's recognition program, I've prepared preliminary documentation for establishing the Cultural Heritage Initiative as a distinct program within the existing Blackwood Foundation structure. This approach provides suitable prominence while maintaining appropriate governance oversight." We spent the next hour reviewing legal frameworks, funding parameters, and governance protocols for the new program, designing a structure that would honor Victoria's social contributions while channeling her energies toward constructive engagement rather than resentful interference. As our meeting concluded, Mr. Fletcher hesitated, then placed the wooden box on the table between us. "There is one additional matter your grandmother asked me to address once you had begun settling into your new responsibilities." He opened the box to reveal an antique silver key nested in velvet lining. "This opens a private vault at Maritime Trust Bank containing personal correspondence and journals your grandmother maintained throughout her life. She was quite explicit that these materials should only be accessed after you had begun implementing your vision for Blackwood's future, not before." "Another test?" I asked, uncertain whether to feel honored by her continued guidance or frustrated by the ongoing conditions attached to my inheritance. "Not a test, in my understanding," Mr. Fletcher replied carefully. "Rather, a deliberate sequencing she believed would serve your development as a leader. She was concerned that premature access to her personal reflections might unduly influence your own thinking at a time when she wanted you to trust your judgment." I accepted. The key, its weight substantial in my palm. "Did she leave similar materials for Vanessa?" "No," he confirmed, though she did leave specific instructions regarding certain family heirlooms that are to be transferred to your sister on her 35th birthday, regardless of whether she accepts a role within the restructured Blackwood organizations. This provision, another piece of grandmother's elaborate posthumous choreography, suggested she had indeed considered Vanessa's future development, rather than simply minimizing her inheritance out of disappointment. After Mr. Fletcher departed, I sat alone in the library, the silver key cool against my skin as I contemplated its significance. Grandmother had created yet another revelation to be unveiled at a time of her choosing, extending her influence beyond death through carefully timed disclosures. The pattern might have seemed controlling from anyone else, but I recognized it as an extension of Eleanor Blackwood's lifelong methodical approach to development, her own and others. She had built Blackwood Enterprises through strategic patience, making moves that often revealed their full purpose only years later. She had applied the same long-term perspective to preparing her granddaughters for their respective roles in her legacy, whether we recognized that preparation or not. I placed the key in my pocket, deciding to visit the vault later in the week after making progress on more immediate priorities. Whatever insights Grandmother's private writings might offer, they would be most valuable when I had established my own direction rather than searching her words for instructions. My phone chimed with an incoming email from Vanessa, the promised brand strategy concepts she had mentioned that morning. Opening the attached presentation revealed 30 meticulously designed slides outlining an integrated messaging framework for the regenerative Blackwood initiative she proposed to launch across all family enterprises. The depth and thoughtfulness of the work surpassed my expectations. Rather than superficial greenwashing or image-focused platitudes, Vanessa had developed substantive connections between the conservation initiative's environmental methodologies and potential applications throughout Blackwood's business units, packaged in compelling narratives targeted to specific stakeholder groups. Most surprisingly, she had accurately represented the scientific foundations of our approach, demonstrating stronger understanding of our actual work than she had ever acknowledged in family conversations. The distinction between her public dismissal of environmental priorities and her apparent private comprehension of their value added yet another layer to my reevaluation of the sister I thought I knew. I began drafting a response, offering specific feedback on her proposals while attaching my preliminary thoughts on her partnership conditions. The emerging framework represented neither complete acceptance nor fundamental revision of her request, but thoughtful engagement with the possibilities her involvement might create. As evening approached, I gathered my materials and prepared to return to the gardener's cottage, still more comfortable in that modest space than in the grandeur of the main house. Before leaving the library, I paused at Grandmother's desk, running, my fingers along the smooth wood where she had written countless letters, reviewed innumerable reports, and apparently planned the elaborate restructuring of both her fortune and her family's future. "I'm trying to understand what you really wanted," I murmured to the empty room, "not just for Blackwood Enterprises or the Conservation Initiative, but for Vanessa and me. For our relationship as sisters." The library offered no audible response, but as I turned to leave, my gaze fell on a small framed photograph I hadn't previously noticed tucked among the bookshelves. It showed two young girls, unmistakably Vanessa and me despite our youth, building an elaborate sand castle on what appeared to be the Cape Cod beach. Vanessa, perhaps 7 years old, directed the architectural vision with characteristic authority, while I, about 5, meticulously implemented the design, carefully packing wet sand into stable foundations. Even then, our distinct approaches had been evident. Vanessa envisioning dramatic turrets and ambitious scope, me ensuring structural integrity and practical execution. Together, we had created something neither could have accomplished alone. The photograph, positioned where Grandmother would have seen it regularly while working at her desk, suggested that perhaps Eleanor's vision for her granddaughters had always included complementary contribution rather than winner-take-all succession. Perhaps the seeming competition she had fostered between us had actually been preparation for eventual collaboration, each developing distinct strengths that would ultimately converge in service of a shared legacy. As I left the library that evening, the silver key in my pocket and Vanessa's brand strategy on my tablet, I considered the possibility that Grandmother's final lesson wasn't about individual worthiness to inherit her fortune, but about the necessity of diverse perspectives in sustaining meaningful enterprise across generations. The path ahead remained challenging, integrating disparate organizational cultures, managing family dynamics, implementing sustainability transformations across multiple industries. Yet for the first time since the will reading, I glimpsed a coherent purpose behind grandmother's elaborate arrangements that transcended simple approval of one granddaughter over another. She had been building toward partnership all along, offering each of us the opportunity to contribute our authentic strengths to a shared purpose greater than either could achieve independently. Whether Vanessa and I could fulfill that vision remained to be seen, but the possibility itself represented a more promising inheritance than mere financial assets. The chance to transform not just Blackwood Enterprises, but our understanding of ourselves and each other in the process. 3 days after receiving the silver key from Mr. Fletcher, I finally found time to visit Maritime Trust Bank. The imposing granite building in downtown Boston's financial district had housed the wealth of New England's oldest families for generations. Blackwood accounts had resided there since the bank's founding in 1897, passed through 5 generations with the discretion that old money demands and new money covets. I arrived at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday morning, dressed in a conservative navy suit that represented my concession to the formality such institutions silently required. The cavernous main hall echoed with the hushed tones of serious financial matters, marble floors amplifying each footstep as if announcing one's presence to the pantheon of wealth. "Good morning, Ms. Blackwood," greeted the private client manager who met me in the reception area. "I'm Patricia Winters. We received word from Mr. Fletcher that you would be accessing your grandmother's personal vault today." She led me through a series of increasingly secure areas, each transition marked by subtle authentication measures, a discreet facial recognition camera here, a biometric scanner disguised as a decorative panel there. The security was thorough, but deliberately unobtrusive, maintaining the illusion that trust rather than technology protected the assets within. Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood maintained this private vault for over 40 years, Patricia explained as we reached the final secured door. Unlike the family's business holdings or investment portfolios, this repository contains materials she designated as strictly personal. We were instructed that only you would be granted access following her passing, and only after Mr. Fletcher provided the authorization key. The room beyond contained a single antique desk, 2 chairs, and a wall of numbered drawers ranging from small safe deposit boxes to larger storage units. Patricia indicated a particular drawer, number 1928, grandmother's birth year, and discreetly withdrew. "Take whatever time you need, Ms. Blackwood. This area is completely private. When you've finished, simply press the call button by the door, and I'll return to escort you out." Alone in the hushed chamber, I approached the drawer with a curious mixture of anticipation and apprehension. What final messages had grandmother left in this secure repository? What insights or revelations awaited that she had deemed too sensitive for the formal inheritance process? The silver key slid smoothly into the lock, turning with a satisfying click that seemed to mark yet another threshold in my continuing inheritance journey. Inside the drawer lay several leather-bound journals, bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon, and a sealed envelope with my name written in grandmother's elegant hand. I began with the envelope, carefully breaking the wax seal to reveal a letter dated just 3 months before her death. "My dearest Olivia, if you are reading this, you have begun the process of assuming leadership of our family's enterprises and have demonstrated the initial judgment and resolve I anticipated. The materials in this vault represent the private record of my life's true work, not the public accomplishments or financial successes that society recognizes, but the deeper purpose that has guided my decisions for over half a century. What I have not shared with anyone, not even Mr. Fletcher, is that the path you now walk is one I did not create, but rather inherited myself. The structure of Eleanor's trust, the strategic separation of public and private holdings, the careful evaluation of character over capability, these were methodologies passed to me by my own grandmother, Constance Blackwood, when I was only slightly older than you are now. Constance recognized in me what I later recognized in you. The capacity to value stewardship over ownership, to measure success beyond financial metrics, and to consider impacts beyond quarterly statements. She orchestrated her own version of the inheritance transition you have recently experienced, challenging the expectations of her era even more dramatically than I have challenged ours. The journals contained in this vault document not only my experiences as the hidden guardian of the Blackwood legacy, but also Constance's guidance from the time before. They reveal a lineage of women who have quietly shaped our family's resources toward purposes that their contemporaries often neither understood nor valued. I have added my observations about you and Vanessa, chronicling the development I observed in both of you and my reasoning for the particular distribution of responsibilities I ultimately designed. You will find that my assessment of your sister is more nuanced than perhaps the formal inheritance arrangements suggested. Vanessa possesses gifts that complement your own, though she has often misdirected them toward superficial achievements rather than substantive contribution. The future of Blackwood now rests in your hands, guided by your wisdom and vision. These private records offer context, but not instruction. Your path must be determined by the challenges of your time, not the solutions of mine. With profound faith in your judgment, grandmother. I set the letter aside, momentarily overwhelmed by its implications. The narrative I had constructed, of grandmother's innovative reimagining of our family's legacy, now expanded to include a heritage of progressive female leadership stretching back generations. My inheritance represented not a disruption of tradition but its continuation, not an innovation but an evolution. The oldest journal in the collection dated from 1949, when Eleanor was just 21, the same age at which I had first begun working in environmental conservation. The parallel struck me as I carefully opened the leather binding to find youthful handwriting that still contained hints of the elegant script that would later become so familiar in grandmother's correspondence. Grandmother Constance has proposed something extraordinary, the first entry began. While father and the board assume I am being prepared for some merely decorative role in the family business, Constance has revealed her true intentions. For 3 generations, the women of our family have maintained a separate channel of influence and investment, operating parallel to but distinct from the public face of Blackwood Industries. I spent the next 2 hours immersed in Eleanor's early journals, discovering her initial skepticism about Constance's unconventional approach, her gradual awakening to the possibilities it presented, and her eventual commitment to continuing the matrilineal tradition of purpose-driven wealth stewardship. What emerged was a remarkable hidden history of the Blackwood fortune, how successive generations of women had quietly directed portions of the family resources toward progressive causes long before such investments were socially acceptable or financially fashionable. While the men of the family had maintained the public business empire with its focus on traditional industries and conventional success metrics, the women had systematically built a parallel infrastructure focused on long-term societal benefit rather than mere accumulation. In the 1950s, Eleanor had directed discrete funding toward early environmental research when conservation was still considered a fringe concern. In the 1960s, she had quietly supported educational access for underserved communities through scholarship, programs structured to appear as conventional charity while actually addressing systemic barriers. By the 1970s, she had begun the careful process of separating the most promising Blackwood business units from those with problematic environmental or social impacts, creating the foundation for what would eventually become Eleanor's Trust. The Bai journals from the 1990s began to include observations about Vanessa and me as children, noting patterns of behavior and inclination that apparently informed grandmother's eventual inheritance decisions. Her assessments were remarkably perceptive, identifying core characteristics that remained consistent even as our specific interests and activities evolved. Vanessa at 7 already demonstrates remarkable social intelligence, she wrote. Her ability to read a room, to intuit what others desire or fear, and to position herself advantageously within any group dynamic is extraordinary. She naturally gravitates toward leadership, but currently measures success through external validation rather than intrinsic value creation. The challenge will be directing these gifts toward substantive contribution rather than mere status acquisition. About me, she observed. Olivia shows unusual persistence in pursuing interests that capture her attention, regardless of external recognition or encouragement. At 5, she spent 3 hours reconstructing a terrarium after the glass broke, methodically saving each plant and carefully recreating the ecosystem. She appears indifferent to praise but deeply satisfied by functional outcomes and natural harmony. Her challenge will be developing the confidence to assert her values in contexts that prioritize more conventional measures of achievement. As the journals progressed through our adolescence and young adulthood, grandmother's observations became increasingly focused on how our respective strengths might eventually complement each other in managing the Blackwood legacy, despite our apparent divergence in values and interests. The traditional solution would be to select one granddaughter as primary successor, she wrote when Vanessa and I were in our 20s. Conventional wisdom would favor Vanessa with her business acumen and social prominence, but I have observed Constance's wisdom in recognizing that leadership emerges in different forms, each suited to different aspects of wealth stewardship. Vanessa excels at navigating institutional structures and social capital deployment. Olivia demonstrates superior, long-term thinking and values alignment. Neither alone possesses the complete skill set that sustaining the Blackwood legacy will require. The final journal, begun just 2 years before grandmother's death, documented her careful construction of the inheritance arrangement I was now implementing, the establishment of the Conservation Initiative as my testing ground, the strategic positioning of Blackwood business units for eventual integration with sustainability principles, and her ongoing assessment of both Vanessa's and my readiness for our respective roles. The separation of awareness has become necessary, she wrote in one of the last entries. Olivia must develop her leadership capabilities without the distorting influence of anticipated inheritance. Vanessa must reveal her authentic priorities without the moderating effect of uncertain succession. Only by observing them operating according to their true values, Olivia believing she must make her way independently, Vanessa believing her position is secure, can I determine the appropriate balance of responsibility to entrust to each. The final pages included surprisingly warm reflections on Vanessa's potential, despite the inheritance distribution that might have suggested grandmother had judged her harshly. Vanessa possesses capabilities that remain partially untapped, because she has directed them toward gaining my approval rather than finding her authentic purpose. The inheritance structure I have designed may initially appear as rejection, but it actually creates space for her to discover her own meaningful contribution beyond the role she believed she needed to fulfill. The material assets I have left her provide security without responsibility, allowing her to explore purpose without pressure. Whether she ultimately chooses to partner with Olivia in the reimagined Blackwood enterprises or pursues an entirely different path, she will do so, from self-knowledge rather than obligation. About me, grandmother's final assessment was both affirming and challenging. Olivia has demonstrated the core values and capabilities needed to guide Blackwood's evolution toward meaningful impact in a changing world. The question that remains is whether she will develop the confidence to assert those values when facing inevitable resistance from established interests and the courage to include perspectives that challenge her own when assembling her leadership team. The isolation that has allowed her authentic development must give way to strategic collaboration if she is to fully realize the potential I have observed. I close the final journal, my mind reeling from this expanded understanding of not just my inheritance, but the generations of purposeful women who had shaped it long before I entered the picture. The Blackwood legacy was far richer and more complex than the financial empire it appeared to be on the surface. It represented A continuous thread of progressive vision maintained through decades when such perspectives had little public support or recognition. Among the remaining materials in the vault, I discovered correspondence between Eleanor and Constance from the 1950s and 60s, illuminating how they had navigated the male-dominated business world of their era, while systematically building alternative channels for impact. I found detailed documentation of investment strategies specifically designed for long-term societal benefit rather than merely financial return. And perhaps most surprisingly, I discovered draft frameworks for potential collaboration between Vanessa and me that grandmother had developed years before either of us had demonstrated our adult capabilities. By the time I gathered the most immediately relevant materials to take with me, nearly 4 hours had passed. The vault had revealed not just grandmother's private thoughts, but an entire hidden dimension of our family's history and purpose, a legacy of progressive stewardship carried forward by Blackwood women while the men of the family maintained its conventional business empire. As Patricia escorted me back through the secure areas of the bank, I felt the weight of this expanded inheritance. I was not merely Eleanor Blackwood's chosen successor, but the latest in a line of women who had recognized that wealth could serve as more than a measure of status or a means of control. It could function as a transformative tool for addressing the most significant challenges of their respective eras. Emerging from the bank into the bright afternoon sunlight, I called Marco to postpone our scheduled strategy meeting. "Something's come up," I explained. "I need a few hours to process new information that affects our overall approach." "Anything I should be concerned about?" he asked. "No," I assured him. "Actually, it's quite the opposite. I've discovered additional context that strengthens the foundations of what we're building. I'll explain tomorrow." My next call was to Vanessa, who answered with the crisp efficiency that characterized her professional interactions. "I was just about to contact you," she said before I could explain my reason for calling. "The draft partnership agreement your attorney sent over needs several modifications, particularly regarding decision thresholds for brand-related investments." "I'm sure it does," I acknowledged, "but that's not why I'm calling. Are you free for dinner this evening? There's something important I need to share with you." The momentary silence suggested my serious tone had registered. "Is everything all right with the trust? Has there been some legal challenge?" "Nothing like that," I assured her. "It's about grandmother and a broader context for the inheritance arrangement that I've just discovered. I think you should hear it directly, rather than through attorneys or formal documents." Another pause, then. "I can be at the house by 7. Should I prepare for good news or bad?" "Neither, exactly," I replied thoughtfully. "It's more illuminating, about grandmother's true intentions and a family history that neither of us fully understood." After ending the call, I headed not to the main house, but to the Conservation Initiative's offices. Though I had postponed the formal strategy meeting, I needed the familiar environment of my professional home base to process the vault's revelations before presenting them to Vanessa. The initiative's headquarters occupied a renovated industrial building near the waterfront, a space deliberately chosen for its embodiment of adaptive reuse principles. The brick walls and exposed beams that had once supported textile manufacturing now housed environmental scientists, policy specialists, and sustainability strategists working to transform humanity's relationship with natural systems. My office occupied a corner with windows overlooking both the harbor and the native plant demonstration garden we had installed on the adjacent lot. The space contained my professional history, framed photographs of restoration sites, technical manuals on ecological systems, awards for innovation in conservation methodologies. This had been my world before inheritance had expanded my responsibilities and resources. Settling at my desk, I began organizing the insights from grandmother's journals into a coherent narrative that I could share with Vanessa. The task required careful consideration. How much of this multi-generational female leadership tradition should I reveal? How would Vanessa react to learning that our inheritance arrangement continued a pattern established long before either of us was born? By 6 o'clock, I had distilled the essential elements into a presentation that I hoped would provide Vanessa with context without overwhelming her with historical details. I gathered the most relevant journal excerpts, particularly those that demonstrated grandmother's nuanced assessment of Vanessa's capabilities and potential contribution. The drive to the Blackwood estate gave me time to rehearse my approach. This conversation would require delicate handling. Vanessa's pride had already been wounded by the initial inheritance revelation, and this additional layer of family history might either heal or deepen that injury depending on how she received it. When I arrived, I found Vanessa already waiting in the library, examining the bookshelves with new attention. She wore casual elegance, tailored black pants, and a simple cream blouse that suggested deliberate understatement rather than her usual status signaling. "So this is where the secrets live," she said by way of greeting, gesturing to the surrounding books. "How many of these volumes do you suppose contain hidden messages or coded instructions for the next generation of Blackwood?" "Women?" Her tone balanced between irony and genuine inquiry. I set my bag containing grandmother's journals on the desk before responding. More than either of us realized, apparently, though the real repository of family secrets was significantly more secure than these shelves. I explained my visit to Maritime Trust and the private vault grandmother had maintained for decades. As I began sharing the contents of her letter and the revelations about our female ancestors' hidden leadership tradition, Vanessa's expression shifted from skeptical curiosity to focused intensity. "You're telling me that grandmother's arrangements weren't her innovation at all? That this pattern of secret female control alongside public male management has been happening for generations?" "At least 3 generations that I can document," I confirmed. "Possibly longer, though the records in the vault only go back to Constance's era." Vanessa paced the library, processing this expanded family narrative. So all this time, while the Blackwood men thought they were running the family empire, they were managing certain aspects of it, I clarified. The journals suggest a deliberate division of focus. The men handled traditional business operations, public representation, and conventional growth metrics. Meanwhile, the women directed resources toward longer-term societal challenges, environmental sustainability, and systemic change initiatives. And neither side fully understood what the other was doing, Vanessa mused. The perfect compartmentalization strategy. Grandmother learned this from her grandmother, and now you're learning it from her. With one significant difference, I pointed out. I'm sharing it with you rather than maintaining the separation. That's why I called you today instead of simply incorporating this historical context into my own planning. Vanessa stopped pacing and studied me with new intensity. Why? Why break the pattern of secrecy now? The question was perceptive and deserved an honest answer. Because I think the circumstances that made secrecy necessary in previous generations have changed. Constance operated in an era when women couldn't even open bank accounts without male permission. Eleanor faced marginally better conditions, but still confronted systematic exclusion from business leadership. They needed parallel systems because the primary structures wouldn't accommodate their vision or recognize their authority. "And you think those barriers no longer exist?" Vanessa challenged, though her tone suggested genuine inquiry rather than dismissal. "I think they've evolved rather than disappeared," I acknowledged. "But I also think that the challenges we face now, climate destabilization, ecosystem collapse, resource depletion, require more integrated approaches than compartmentalized management allows." Grandmother seemed to recognize this evolution in her final journal entries. I handed Vanessa several pages I had photocopied from the last journal, including grandmother's nuanced assessment of her potential and the draft frameworks for possible collaboration between us. She read silently, her expression unreadable until she reached the final paragraph. She actually believed in me. Vanessa said quietly, despite arranging the inheritance to suggest otherwise. She believed in your capabilities, I confirmed, while questioning the direction in which you were applying them. The inheritance structure wasn't punishment, but recalibration, creating conditions that might redirect your considerable talents toward more substantive impact. Vanessa set the pages on grandmother's desk, her movements deliberate as she processed this reframing of her inheritance experience. So the partnership you proposed wasn't just your idea, it was part of grandmother's design all along. Apparently, so though I didn't know that when I suggested it, I said. I proposed it based on practical assessment of complementary skills. She had been contemplating similar collaboration for years, according to her journals. And where does this leave us? Vanessa asked. Do we simply fulfill the roles she envisioned, like characters following a script written before we were fully formed? The question struck at the heart of the tension I had been feeling since discovering the vault's contents, the balance between honoring this remarkable female legacy and asserting my own vision for Blackwood's future. I think we acknowledge the wisdom in grandmother's assessment of our respective strengths without being constrained by her specific implementation ideas, I suggested. The journals make clear that each generation faced different challenges requiring different approaches. Constance established the parallel system that Eleanor maintained and expanded. Now we determine what evolution is necessary for our era. Vanessa considered this, then nodded slowly. A legacy of principle rather than prescription. That actually feels more liberating than limiting. Exactly, I agreed, relieved that she had grasped the essential point. Knowing this history doesn't dictate our decisions, but provides context that might inform them. It changes nothing about the practical partnership discussions we've already begun, but it adds dimension to understanding why that collaboration might succeed. We spent the next hour reviewing selected passages from grandmother's journals, focusing particularly on her observations of our development and her evolving thinking about how our different approaches might eventually complement each other. Vanessa absorbed these insights with remarkable openness, occasionally smiling at particularly accurate assessments of her childhood tendencies, or nodding in recognition of patterns grandmother had identified long before we recognized them ourselves. It's almost unsettling, she admitted as we concluded our review, to realize how thoroughly she understood aspects of my personality that I'm only now beginning to recognize in myself. She saw my social intelligence as a legitimate skill rather than mere manipulation tactics, even while critiquing how I was applying it. She saw us both more clearly than we saw ourselves, I observed. Perhaps because she recognized patterns she had witnessed across generations, how differently women express leadership when conventional paths are limited or closed entirely. As our conversation wound down, Vanessa glanced at her watch. I should go. I have an early meeting tomorrow with the Blackwood Foundation Board. Assuming that's still happening given all these revelations? All existing commitments and structures remain in place while we develop our integrated approach, I confirmed, including the Victoria Blackwood Cultural Heritage Program we discussed. Mother called yesterday, by the way. She seems cautiously pleased with the recognition, though still processing the broader inheritance arrangement. Vanessa gathered her things, then paused before leaving. One more question about the journals. Did grandmother say anything about why she maintained the pretense that I was the favored heir all those years? Why she let me believe I would inherit everything while quietly preparing you for actual leadership? The question contained lingering hurt beneath its practical inquiry. I considered how best to address the emotional dimension without dismissing it. She wrote that she needed to observe our authentic characters operating under conditions that wouldn't distort our natural tendencies, I explained. That meant creating circumstances where you felt secure in your position, while I believed I needed to make my own way independently. She thought those conditions would reveal our true priorities and approaches. A lifetime social experiment, with her own granddaughters as subjects, Vanessa said. a flash of the old bitterness surfacing briefly. A careful assessment conducted by someone who understood the weight of the responsibility she was transferring, I countered gently. Remember, she inherited a similar evaluation process from Constance. This wasn't casual manipulation, but a methodical approach to succession planning refined across generations. Vanessa absorbed this perspective, her expression softening slightly. I suppose there's something almost reassuring about placing our experience within this longer tradition. It wasn't personal rejection, but continuation of a system bigger than either of us. A system designed to ensure that Blackwood resources serve meaningful purposes, rather than merely perpetuating wealth for its own sake, I added. Whatever their methods, these women were trying to direct substantial assets toward addressing the most significant challenges of their respective eras. That's a legacy worth continuing, even if we adapt the specific approaches. As Vanessa prepared to leave, she gestured toward the journals I had brought from the vault. Will you share more of these with me? I'd like to understand the full context of what we're stepping into. Of course, I agreed readily. I'll have copies made of the most relevant sections. Though I think you might find grandmother's observations about you particularly interesting. They show a level of respect for your capabilities that wasn't always evident in her direct interactions with you. That would be illuminating, Vanessa acknowledged. Perhaps we can review them together once I've had time to process today's revelations. After she departed, I remained in the library, surrounded by books that now carried additional significance as symbols of the knowledge transfer between Blackwood women across generations. The expanded understanding of my inheritance brought both clarity and complexity, confirmation that my leadership approach aligned with a venerable tradition, while raising new questions about how to adapt that tradition for contemporary challenges. I returned to the gardener's cottage that evening with several of grandmother's journals, settling into the simple space that now represented not modest accommodation, but deliberate preparation. The cottage grandmother had designed specifically, for me now appeared as part of a larger pattern, the creation of appropriate environments for each generation's designated steward to develop their particular vision for the Blackwood legacy. As I reviewed more of Eleanor's early journals before sleep, I was struck by her initial reactions upon learning of Constance's secret management system, the same blend of surprise, validation, and responsibility that I now experienced. She, too, had questioned whether to maintain the parallel structure or attempt integration. She, too, had weighed the benefits of secrecy against the potential power of transparency. The continuity across generations provided a foundation for my own decision-making without dictating specific choices. Eleanor had preserved Constance's core principles while adapting implementation strategies to address the challenges of her era. Now that responsibility passed to me, to honor the progressive vision these remarkable women had maintained while developing approaches suitable for the environmental and social imperatives of my time. As I drifted toward sleep, one particular passage from Eleanor's journals in her mid-30s remained in my thoughts. The true test of leadership is not whether one follows established patterns perfectly, but whether one recognizes when evolution becomes necessary and has the courage to implement change while preserving essential principles. Constance gave me not rigid instructions, but adaptive wisdom. My responsibility is to apply that wisdom to challenges she could not have foreseen, just as future generations must adapt my approaches to circumstances I cannot predict. That insight, the balance between honoring legacy and embracing evolution, would guide my approach to integrating Vanessa's brand expertise with the Conservation Initiative's environmental mission and Blackwood Enterprises' market position. We were not merely implementing grandmother's design, but advancing a multi-generational commitment to purposeful wealth stewardship, adapted for the specific demands of our era. The silver key that had opened the vault now rested on my bedside table, no longer just the means to access hidden knowledge, but a symbol of the responsibility that knowledge conveyed. The secret history of Blackwood women had been revealed not to constrain my choices, but to inform them, not to limit innovation, but to ground it in principles that had guided our family's true impact for generations. 3 weeks after the vault. Revelations. Vanessa and I stood before the assembled executive leadership of Blackwood Enterprises in the company's modernist boardroom. The 30-story headquarters in downtown Boston had always symbolized the family's commercial power. Gleaming glass and steel rising above the historic streets, its presence on the skyline a testament to generations of business acumen. Today, however, we entered not as observers or ceremonial figureheads, but as architects of transformation. The trust's controlling interest gave our presentation more than advisory weight. It carried the authority of ownership and direction. I had intentionally scheduled this meeting to coincide with the quarterly business review, ensuring that all division heads and senior executives would be present for this pivotal announcement. "Good morning," I began, surveying the faces around the polished walnut table. Most were unfamiliar to me, veteran executives who had built their careers within Blackwood's traditional corporate structure. A few nodded politely, though their expressions revealed uncertainty about my presence at what had historically been an internal business meeting. For those who haven't met me, I'm Olivia Blackwood, Executive Director of the Blackwood Conservation Initiative, and now the controlling trustee of Eleanor's Trust, which holds majority interest in Blackwood Enterprises. This statement produced subtle shifts in posture around the table, straightening spines, increased attention. With me is my sister, Vanessa Blackwood, who will be assuming the role of Chief Brand Officer across all Blackwood entities. Vanessa stepped forward, impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that projected authority while deliberately avoiding ostentation. "Thank you for accommodating this presentation within your scheduled review. We recognize the importance of your ongoing operations and aim to minimize disruption while initiating necessary strategic evolution." Her tone struck the perfect balance, respectful of their expertise while firmly establishing our authority. We had carefully choreographed this introduction during extensive preparation sessions, recognizing that this first impression would set the foundation for either cooperation or resistance. For the next 40 minutes, we outlined the new vision for Blackwood Enterprises, not a radical departure from its industrial foundations, but a strategic realignment that integrated sustainability principles with existing business units. Using the careful language of corporate transformation rather than environmental activism, we presented the economic case for transition toward regenerative business models, renewable energy adoption, and circular resource systems. "The market is already moving in this direction," Vanessa emphasized, displaying trend analyses that her team had assembled. Leading indicators suggest that companies failing to integrate sustainability into core operations face increasing regulatory constraints, consumer rejection, and investor hesitation. Our research indicates potential market share erosion of 12 to 18% within 3 years for companies maintaining status quo approaches. I followed with the implementation framework, connecting the conservation initiative's proven methodologies to specific Blackwood business units. We're not proposing theoretical models, but proven approaches that can be scaled across your operations. The initiative has demonstrated these systems at pilot scale, generating both environmental improvements and cost efficiencies that translate directly to your industrial applications. The executives listened with professional attention, though several exchanged glances during our more ambitious proposals. When we opened the floor for questions, the Chief Operations Officer, Martin Hayward, was the first to speak. "This is certainly a comprehensive vision," he acknowledged, his tone carefully diplomatic. "However, I'm concerned about implementation timelines. Retrofitting our manufacturing facilities to these specifications would require significant capital expenditure and operational disruption. The quarterly impacts would be substantial." "We've anticipated those concerns," Vanessa responded before I could address the objection. The implementation roadmap includes phased transitions specifically designed to minimize quarterly performance impacts. Additionally, we've identified external funding sources through green infrastructure initiatives that can offset approximately 40% of the capital requirements. Her command of both their operational language and their underlying concerns impressed me. While I had focused on the technical feasibility of the transition, Vanessa had anticipated the cultural and financial resistance points with remarkable precision. For the next hour, we fielded increasingly detailed questions about everything from supply chain implications to market positioning. The initial skepticism gradually shifted toward provisional engagement as executives recognized that our proposal was neither idealistic fantasy nor hostile takeover, but a carefully constructed business evolution backed by substantial research and resources. The CEO, Richard Townsend, had remained conspicuously quiet throughout the exchange, observing the discussion with the measured neutrality of someone assessing not just the proposal, but the dynamics unfolding around it. As the session approached its scheduled conclusion, he finally spoke. This represents a significant departure from approaches that have built Blackwood Enterprises into the company it is today, he noted, his voice carrying the weight of 27 years at the company's helm. While I appreciate the thoughtfulness of your presentation, such fundamental realignment requires careful consideration beyond a single meeting. Of course, I acknowledged. We're not expecting immediate implementation. Decisions. What we are initiating today is a structured transition process, beginning with comprehensive assessment of each division's specific opportunities and challenges. The assessment teams will include both your operational experts and sustainability specialists from the initiative, Vanessa added, creating shared understanding rather than imposed solutions. Townsend nodded slightly. And the board's position on this strategic shift? The board will be formally briefed next week, I confirmed. However, as Eleanor's trust holds controlling interest, the direction has been established. The board's input will naturally be valuable in refining implementation approaches. The subtle power dynamic wasn't lost on anyone in the room. While framed diplomatically, my response made clear that this transformation would proceed with or without enthusiastic board endorsement. I see, Townsend said after a measured pause. Then I look forward to working with you both to ensure this transition maintains Blackwood's market position and operational excellence while pursuing these expanded objectives. As the meeting concluded, Vanessa smoothly engaged several key executives in follow-up conversations, demonstrating her gift for personalized connection even in potentially adversarial situations. I noticed how she adjusted her approach for each individual, emphasizing financial metrics with the CFO, implementation flexibility with the COO, and market differentiation with the marketing director. We departed the headquarters together, waiting until we reached the privacy of the car before discussing the meeting's outcome. They're cautiously receptive, Vanessa assessed as our driver navigated Boston's crowded streets. Townsend will be the linchpin. If he genuinely engages rather than performatively complies, the rest of the executive team will follow. His concerns aren't unreasonable, I acknowledged. We are asking them to fundamentally reconsider approaches that have defined their professional identities and success metrics, which is why we need to give him a graceful path to embrace the transition as partly his own vision, Vanessa said thoughtfully. His legacy at Blackwood is approaching its final chapter. This transformation could either undermine that legacy or become its crowning achievement, depending on how we position his role in the process. Her insight into the human dynamics beneath the corporate structure continued to impress me. While I had focused on the technical and environmental dimensions of our proposal, Vanessa instinctively grasped the personal narratives and institutional politics that would ultimately determine its success or failure. The real test will come when we initiate the division assessments, I noted. Abstract discussions of sustainability integration are one thing. Detailed examinations of current practices and specific change requirements will generate more resistance. Which is why we need to control the narrative from the beginning, Vanessa replied. I've already drafted communications guidelines for the assessment teams, emphasizing opportunity identification rather than deficiency documentation. The language we use will shape how the process is perceived. Her foresight in preparing these materials before the meeting reflected the thoroughness I had increasingly come to appreciate in her approach. While her previous focus on social positioning had seemed superficial, those same skills were proving invaluable when applied to meaningful organizational change. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.